I'm going to go ahead with the meeting beginning ritual. 起立，面向佛堂，参加先鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位的传世一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。
All righty, sir. And good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you happen to be today. Welcome to the June the 25th installment of the online Tao study group. It's a wonderful, beautiful, sunny day here in Indianapolis. It's not too terribly warm just yet. I'm still sitting around in a sweatshirt, but it sure is pretty. It's just a beautiful summer day, and I'm very happy that it's summer. As usual, I'm not really a winter kind of a person. Anyway, that being said, I hope you're all having a great Sunday, and we'll just go ahead and move on. The sentence you see in front of you on my title screen, yield and remain whole, is the first sentence in chapter 22 of the Dao De Jing. It also happens to be amongst the first couple of lines in the classic of Tai Chi Chuan by Tom Fong. For those of you who do not know who Tom Fong is, just a little tiny bit of a history lesson before the official announcement of the little tiny history lesson. Tom Fong was the Taoist monk who originated, discovered, divined, whatever term you want to use, who invented the fundamentals of Tai Chi Chuan, what we all know here in the West as Tai Chi. He was, without a doubt, a brilliant individual who saw things in ways that other people didn't see them. Now, as with Bodhidharma and Lao Tzu and several other historical figures, there is a raging debate in some scholarly circles as to whether or not Tom Fong actually existed. That same question gets asked of Lao Tzu, who he was, what his real name was, where he was from, whether or not he actually lived. I'm going to tell you guys, as I say every time this topic comes up in one of my talks, that as far as I'm concerned, whether or not the person being referenced was a real historical person or not, to me is completely irrelevant. And I'll tell you why. Whether or not the person to whom the teachings is attributed existed or not doesn't have any bearing at all on the validity of the teachings. The teachings of the Dao De Jing would be no less valid if Lao Tzu had never existed than they are if he did. The same thing applies to the writings and teachings of Tom Fong. The treatise on the practice of Tai Chi Chuan and the principles and foundations that are the underpinning for that martial science are perfectly as valid, whether Tom Fong existed or not. And so my preference is to dispense with the arguments and debates and questions and just get on about attempting to understand the teachings. In this particular case, we only have enough time, maybe, to get through these first two lines of chapter 22 in this context. And so we're going to spend a few weeks dissecting chapter 22 in a Tai Chi Chuan related context, in a world where it's relevant only to the practice of the Taoist teachings and to the practices of Tai Chi Chuan. I find it amazing to a certain degree that both of these scholars chose to utilize these same sentences to describe a couple of fundamental practices. On the part of Lao Tzu, yield and remain whole, bend and remain straight, I'm going to surmise was more of an observation on living life than an observation on the practice of martial sciences. Tom Fong, on the other hand, at least in the frame of reference regarding the classics of Tai Chi Chuan, was concerning himself with a martial discipline and the ways to utilize those techniques to prevent being harmed and to have the most positive outcome possible from a conflict. I do not want to get hung up on the conflict part of the discussion, though. There's a lot more to this than just that. And there is a very definite set of lessons in these two sentences. There is. So what could that possibly be? What could that mean for us? Well, let's consider what it means to yield. In one case, yielding is the act of getting out of the way of things that might be harmful to us. If you think about grass or reeds or palm trees or certain other types of fairly flexible vegetation, when strong winds and storms come, those plants bend and yield to the storm and are not uprooted. Whereas with a certain degree of frequency, the less flexible plants, large trees and that sort of thing, are torn up by the roots. Here in Indiana, we are in the middle of what's called geographically Tornado Alley. For those of you who don't live in the U.S., but who live in areas where you have tornadic activity, you may know these things as typhoons or hurricanes, but they're basically the same weather events. Really, really, really powerful spinning windstorms. They bring a lot of rain and carry a tremendous amount of power. Wind speeds can be upwards of 150 miles an hour. They're very focused, extremely destructive. And I have seen big trees uprooted and laying in the middle of streets here in Indiana as a result of the action of tornadoes. We had 2 trees in our old front yard. One struck by lightning, a couple of them torn down either by the lightning strike or by the wind. And so the power of these things can't be overstated. And yet, in the wake of those tremendously powerful events, the grass in the front yard always seems to survive. It always pops right back up, greens up nicely, and grows about a foot every time one of those huge storms goes over. Well, you know, in life, it works very much the same way. The person who understands the need for flexibility, the need to be able to adapt, to move, to bend, to alter their thinking, survives very frequently in any number of situations where those who lack the ability to utilize that flexibility do not. Translate conflict and survival into a business sense, if you will, right? Let's say that one gets into a disagreement with one's boss, however that manages to occur. At some level, if that escalates far enough, the person on the lower end of the power curve there can wind up in an unsurvivable position, that is, losing their employment. Even if it's not quite so severe, the consequences of getting involved in that disagreement can be unpleasant. One can wind up being humiliated or deprived of authority, or having a decision made for them that they didn't want to have made. All from participating in a conversation with the need to be right out there on their sleeves. That is the very nature of failing to yield, of being inflexible. And just like the large and inflexible trees, when one adopts that mental posture, one eventually is sure to be uprooted. Interestingly enough, in the martial path, that's also the truth. In the practice of Tai Chi Chuan, flexibility and the ability to yield is a foundation of the martial practice. It involves the ability to get out of the way of an attack, to redirect an incoming opponent, to allow the opponent to advance and believe that they're about to win, when in point of fact, due to that flexibility, you wind up never getting touched. That occurs at several different levels, even within the practice of Tai Chi Chuan, which is specifically why I brought this up. In the Tai Chi path, in the martial path, teaching a student to yield and neutralize, two of the foundations of defense, starts out as a purely physical discipline. The entirety of the training, the entirety of a student's thought processes typically is wrapped up in the mechanics of the conflict. That is the fight mechanics, right? The footwork, the movements, the techniques, the forms, all of the physiological and anatomical activities required to force the body to do what it is not accustomed to doing. And those techniques can be very effective. However, on behind learning the physical techniques, there is the discipline of learning to control the essential energies, which differentiates the practice of Tai Chi Chuan from every other martial science on the face of the planet, and allows the practitioner to combine the physiological activities and techniques of the various movements with the energetic techniques that are taught as part of the internal art, the ability to move and control and influence the chi. Okay? At a level up from that is the practice of Tai Chi that doesn't involve conflict at all, but involves the spiritual pursuit of analyzing the self so that we don't wind up in a conflict, so that we walk a path of peace, where having to pay attention to technique and form and conflict and fighting becomes very largely irrelevant, because we don't wind up in a position where those things become necessary. As you all have heard me talk about the shift in my mental focus from being willing to injure or kill somebody who broke into my house to not feeling the need to do so, this is the process that was at work in those cases. The entire philosophy of Tai Chi Chuan is intertwinkled, that's kind of my own word, very, very tightly with Taoist philosophy. It cannot help but be so. Since Tom Fong was a practitioner of the Tao Te Ching, and probably was very familiar with the Dao De Jing and teachings of Lao Tzu, And I say that not from speculation, but because I see the Taoist teachings come up over and over and over and over again in the writings and teachings of Tom Fong. It is clear to me, and I'm hopefully very sure to my students as well, that those two sets of teachings walk hand in hand with each other. Okay? Because of that relationship, the philosophy of Tai Chi Chuan as a martial science is one ultimately of compassion and concern and peace and harmonious relationships and refinement and growth of the self and the spiritual nature of the practitioner. At the highest levels of the practice of Tai Chi Chuan, one is no longer practicing to overcome an opponent, but rather to discipline and overcome the self. And that is a much more difficult set of lessons to master than overcoming any opponent will ever be. Just so you understand, yielding and neutralizing are foundation movements in the early practice of Tai Chi Chuan. One has to learn to yield and neutralize if one's going to be successful at practicing the forms and techniques. Tui So, pushing hands, the practice by which Tai Chi practitioners learn to develop martial proficiency, utilizes yielding and neutralizing continually to redirect the energy of an opponent. Okay? The difference between yielding and neutralizing is that neutralizing brings the energy of an opponent down one side of the body or the other. Yielding brings the energy of the opponent straight in towards the practitioner, but with a plan and with control. It's unwise to yield to an opponent without knowing what it is you intend to do with them once you get them there. Not that it doesn't happen, it just isn't wise. However, those two practices say an awful lot about the practice of Tai Chi Chuan in the Tao teachings to begin with. Both yielding and neutralizing in and of themselves do not necessarily have to bring harm to an opponent. It simply is or are two good ways to get out of the way of somebody who wants to hurt you. Consider that for a moment. While most martial systems are concerned with beating an opponent senseless, the foundation of Tai Chi Chuan is not to beat the opponent senseless. It's to end the conflict by getting out of the way of it. That's an important philosophical point in both life and in martial practice. So what does it mean to yield and remain whole, to bend and remain straight? Well, if we take the example of the trees and the grass, in any conflict, once again, the person who can become flexible has room to maneuver, room to adapt, room to change, room to understand. Those things allow us to deflect the energy of a conflict to anywhere but right at us, to diffuse the impending storm, to remove the emotions from the situation, to gather real understanding about what's about to happen, to process some information, and in the end, to settle the situation with no conflict at all. If that can be done, everybody wins. No matter what the nature of the conflict is, When nobody gets hit and everybody goes home, that's a win for everyone. And it's important. To remain whole, one has to learn to become flexible. To not get hit, one has to learn to bend. However, in the techniques of getting out of the way, there also is hidden tremendous power when there has to be. The ancient masters of Tai Chi weren't fools. They lived in a time where warfare and strife and crime and problems with wild animals and what have you were pandemic and everywhere. Yeah, I don't often walk down the street and worry about being eaten alive by a tiger, but in ancient China, that was a possibility. How do you deal with that? I'm not sure that I know. How do you deal with living in a place that's in a state of constant warfare, where the expatriated soldiers and the people that have been displaced by the conflict, who are simply trying to find a way to survive, want what you have because they have less than you do? Tai Chi Chuan didn't get to be Tai Chi Chuan, the supreme or ultimate, because it wasn't effective. It's unbelievably effective. Okay? It's just that those of us that practice it have an intense and compelling desire not to use it. Neutralizing and yielding are powerful defensive techniques, where if your opponent doesn't get the hint the first couple of times, significant harm and damage can be inflicted on them. Just ask my students. I toss them around every Saturday. And I don't work very hard to do it. It takes so little effort once you understand how yielding and neutralizing works to make them effective. The trick is in learning how. Let that sink in for just a moment or two. Okay? It's not just a martial technique. It isn't just a way to win a fight. These techniques have power in life as well. The mental agility, the ability to adapt, the willingness to be flexible, give us power in life situations as well. They allow us to create understanding where understanding didn't exist, and understanding always is beneficial. That's why Lao Tzu says to yield and remain whole, to bend and remain straight, to be the person who is inflexible and rigid and unyielding and combative. Those attributes do not flow forth from the Tao of peace. And the things that don't originate in the path of the Tao are soon to perish. So, the other thing that's not readily apparent from reading these two lines is what I refer to as the physical, mental, spiritual circle. See, there's a process for all of us in maturing our Tai Chi practice, maturing our Tao practice, and maturing ourselves in life. The processes of refinement and improvement and learning, gaining knowledge and wisdom that we all go through for our entire lives, willingly or not. And make no mistake, we do go through the process. There's absolutely no escape. When we start out, we're always all about the physical existence. in life and in martial practice both. We start out thinking about me, about I, about overcoming the opponent, about winning. Okay? We're all about the forms, the techniques, the footwork, the mechanics, the physics. And it is important to learn those things. But the person who stops there has not developed a real understanding either for life or for martial practice, either one. And so the next step becomes to concern oneself with the mental aspects of the practice. Bruce Lee put it probably the best of anybody I've ever heard when he said, learn technique, master technique, forget technique. At the higher levels of Tai Chi Chuan practice, one learns to respond from precisely where a person's standing. Because in real life, nobody's going to give you 10 minutes to warm up before they try to rob you at the bank machine. Nobody's going to make an announcement for you. Nobody's going to walk up behind you and say, pardon me, I'm getting ready to rob you. So if you have any martial training, now's the time to put your uniform on, get ready to protect yourself. That just isn't the way it happens. Life happens in the blink of an eye. Whether it's a robbery at the ATM or an unexpected business meeting, an unplanned catastrophe, an occurrence that we weren't looking for, something we have to respond to. I had 3 of those this weekend. We're in the middle of a big migration at the office, and we had some stuff happen that I had to respond to right now. It's just part of the process. And so, once we learn the mechanics and the physics and the techniques, then we have to learn to employ them according to the rules of life. Well, guess what? That isn't just a martial lesson. We have to learn to be adaptable and flexible and changeable. We have to learn to be a human being exactly the same way, because life happens by surprise way too frequently. It is when those surprises hit us in the face that we really show off what we understand and what we don't. If you hear somebody screaming in anguish from 3 cubes away from you, that's an individual who maybe doesn't deal with surprises quite as well as some other people. And yes, in our office, we have a couple of those folks. I do my very best not to be one of them. At the level above learning to master the life situations, we focus once again on the opponent. And it sounds like we've come back to square one, but we haven't. I say it's the spiritual part of the circle, because this time when we come back around to the opponent, we're focused on how we help that person get to what they need. Our focus is no longer the conflict. Our focus is the person. And the conflict is diffused with compassion and understanding and wisdom, and not in a contest of physical strength or martial technique. I haven't had to raise a hand in anger to another person on this planet in over 30 years. I hope I never have to do it. But hardly a day goes by at the office where I don't have to try and either make up or under a potentially adversarial situation just because question. And so the decision isn't whether or not the answer is right or wrong, but whether or not it's the best option for the situation. Not everything is black and white. Not everything's cut and dried. Not every conflict gets settled by beating something senseless. And so when we approach the spiritual practices of Tai Chi Chuan, the concern is healing, is repair, is harmony, is a better relationship. It's concern for the other person. It's moving with benevolence and without the intent to cause harm. Does it work? You betcha. Absolutely does. It takes a potentially explosive situation and turns it completely into a non-event where there is absolutely no need for fear because nobody is in danger of being harmed. That's what it means to yield and remain whole, and bend and remain straight. See, to master Tai Chi Chuan, first one has to understand the Tao teachings. People always look at me like I have three heads when I say that. What, you're going to teach me martial arts through a religion? And then I explain why neither one of those statements is true. But yeah, you have to do that. Because Tai Chi Chuan is a Taoist martial science, as well as an extension of that philosophy. You can't have one without the other. But to master the Tao teachings, first one has to understand the self. And mastering the self is the most difficult set of disciplines there is out there. I've been working on both myself and my martial practices for better than 40 years. I'm not too terribly bad at the martial practices, but I still have a long way to go on mastering the self. It's okay though. It's all about the journey, and it's been a lot of fun so far. I will tell you this, learning to yield, learning to bend is such an important step in life, in martial practice, in everything that we do, that two truly great scholars, Lao Zi and John Song Fong, chose to utilize those two sentences as the foundation for part of their classics on the treatise of learning the teachings of the Tao and Tai Chi Chuan. That's some pretty powerful evidence for the effectiveness and truth and power behind those teachings. Thank you all very much, and I truly hope that something I said was useful to somebody. Thank you.
You talked about the historical origin of Tai Chi Chuan, and my commentary is that while somebody invented the original form, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. So there was definitely, a person, a human being that began the whole thing.
I tend to agree. I attribute that to Tom Fong.
Right. Legend points to Dang Fong as the origin of that. Growing up in Taiwan, I read plenty of wuxia novels that featured him as a character, and also there were movies that I saw, depicting his life, his students, etc. So those are things not usually available to people in the West.
No, in fact, you're the one that sent me twin brothers.
Right. So that's a dramatization. It's probably not based on any historical thing, but a lot of good action scenes.
Certainly was a fun movie. And I like to watch Jet Li work.
by the way, even Wing Chun, the foundational study of Bruce Lee, the origin of that is actually open to question as well. It was supposedly invented by a woman, and it was the art, the purpose of that particular style was for someone who was physically smaller to defeat a much larger opponent. So, when you practice with your friend, there's probably, emphasis on close-up combat, very short range, so to speak.
Yes.
And there's a discussion, by the way, that it was invented in the transition from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty, and it was invented as something to help espionage back in those days, or assassination, as the case may be, that calls for very close-up work and then speedy getaway.
Let's go ahead and do the meeting ending ritual, everybody. 起立，面向佛堂，持架三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持架规则是一鞠躬，接班一鞠躬。Okay, everybody, we are done.